Tonight, we will journey together through ancient tales of wisdom and peace. These are stories passed down through generations of Zen masters who discovered profound truths in the simplest moments of life. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. As we begin this journey together, know that this wisdom is not difficult or complicated. It speaks to something you already recognize deep within yourself. You don't need to remember every detail or grasp every meaning. These stories work best when received with an open, relaxed mind. Feel free to let your body settle completely into rest. Allow your breathing to find its own gentle rhythm. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to understand. Tonight, you are just a traveler on an ancient path, guided by wisdom that has brought peace to countless people before you. Relax. Take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin our journey together. In the mountains of ancient China, where morning mist clung to pine trees and the air held the scent of stone and moss, there lived a young student named Wei. He had come to study at a small temple perched on a cliff, drawn by stories of a master whose wisdom was said to be as deep as the valley below and as clear as mountain springs. Wei was eager to learn. His mind moved like quicksilver, jumping from question to question, idea to idea. During meditation periods, his thoughts raced through memories, plans, worries, and dreams. He would shift on his cushion, adjust his posture, and glance around at the other students who seemed to sit as still as the stone statues in the temple courtyard. The temple followed an ancient routine. Each morning before dawn, a single bell would ring 3 times. The sound would float across the temple grounds, calling the monks and students to their first meditation of the day. The bell was old, cast centuries ago by a master craftsman. When struck, it produced a note so pure and resonant that it seemed to fill not just the air, but somehow the very stones of the mountain itself. Wei noticed that when the bell rang, something happened to the other students that puzzled him. They would become completely still, as if the sound itself had turned them to peaceful statues. Their breathing would slow. Their faces would soften. Even after the bell's voice faded into silence, they remained motionless, absorbed in something Wei could not understand. But for Wei, the bell was simply a signal. When it rang, he would hurry to the meditation hall, settle quickly on his cushion, and immediately begin trying to quiet his mind. He would close his eyes and attempt to focus on his breathing, but within moments, his thoughts would carry him away. He would remember something from yesterday, or plan something for tomorrow, or wonder if he was meditating correctly. During the long periods of sitting meditation, Wei would often become restless. His back would ache. His legs would grow stiff. He would count his breaths, then lose count and start over. He would try to empty his mind, only to find it filling with more thoughts. The harder he tried to be still, the more agitated he became. After several months of struggle, Wei approached his teacher, Master Lin. The old master had a weathered face lined with years of gentle smiles and eyes that held the depth of still water. Wei found him in the temple garden, slowly tending to a small grove of bamboo. "Master," Wei said with frustration in his voice, "I have been practicing meditation for months, yet I cannot find the stillness that the other students seem to possess so naturally. My mind is like a wild horse that refuses to be tamed. When the morning bell rings, they become peaceful immediately. But I only become more aware of my restlessness." Master Lin continued his careful work with the bamboo, pruning away dead leaves with gentle precision. He was quiet for so long that Wei began to wonder if the master had heard his question. Finally, Master Lin spoke without looking up from his work. "Tell me, Wei, when the morning bell rings, what do you do?" "I listen to it briefly, then hurry to take my place for meditation." "And what do the other students do?" Wei thought about this. "They seem to listen to the entire sound. They don't move until it fades completely." "Yes," Master Lin said softly. "And tell me, what is the purpose of the bell?" "To call us to meditation, Master." "Perhaps. Or perhaps the bell itself is the meditation." Wei felt confused. "I don't understand, Master. The bell rings for only a few moments. How can such a brief sound be meditation?" Master Lin finally looked up from his work. His eyes held a gentle warmth. "Tomorrow morning, instead of rushing to the meditation hall when the bell rings, I want you to do something different. I want you to listen to the bell as if your life depended on hearing every particle of its sound. Listen not just with your ears, but with your whole body, your whole being. Don't think about meditation. Don't think about anything. Simply receive the gift of that sound completely." The next morning, Wei positioned himself in the courtyard where he knew the bell's voice would reach him clearly. When the first strike came, instead of his usual hurried response, he followed his teacher's instruction. He listened with every fiber of his attention. The sound was extraordinary. It began with a bright, clear note that seemed to emerge from silence itself. But as Wei listened more deeply, he discovered layers within the sound. There were high tones that sparkled like sunlight on water, middle tones that rolled like gentle thunder, and deep undertones that seemed to vibrate in his chest and belly. But the most remarkable discovery was the silence that held the sound. Before the bell was struck, there was silence. The sound emerged from this silence, flowered in it, then gradually returned to it. The silence was not empty. It was full, alive, waiting. It seemed to extend in all directions, infinite and welcoming. As the sound faded, Wei found that his mind had become as still as a mountain lake at dawn. His breathing had naturally slowed and deepened. His body felt relaxed, yet alert. For those few minutes of listening, his restless thoughts had completely disappeared, not because he had fought them, but because he had become so absorbed in receiving the bell's gift that there was no room for anything else. When the sound faded completely into silence, Wei remained motionless for a long time. The stillness that had always seemed so elusive suddenly felt as natural as breathing. He understood now why the other students didn't hurry to the meditation hall. The meditation had already begun. From that day forward, Wei's relationship with both sound and silence transformed. He realized that the bell had been offering him this gift every morning, but he had been too eager to get to formal practice to receive it. The deep listening became his gateway to the stillness that had seemed so impossible to achieve through effort alone. Months later, when new students arrived at the temple and complained about their restless minds during meditation, Wei would share the lesson Master Lin had taught him. "Don't try to create stillness," he would say gently. "Learn to recognize the stillness that is already here, hiding within sound, hiding within silence, hiding even within movement when that movement is met with complete attention." The wisdom of the silent bell teaches us something profound about the nature of peace. We often think of stillness as the absence of sound, the absence of movement, the absence of thought. But true stillness is not absence. It is presence. Complete, absorbed presence with whatever is actually happening in this moment. Wei discovered that his restless mind was not his enemy. His problem was not the presence of thoughts, but his relationship to those thoughts. When he tried to force his mind to be quiet, he created tension. When he learned to listen so completely that thoughts naturally faded into the background, stillness arose by itself. This teaches us that the peace we seek in meditation, in Zen practice, in life itself, is not something we must manufacture through effort. It is something we must learn to notice, to receive, to allow. Like the sound of the ancient bell, peace emerges from silence, exists within sound, and returns to silence. Our job is not to create this peace, but to listen for it with such complete attention that we cannot help but rest in its embrace. The bell in Wei's story represents all the moments in daily life when peace is being offered to us, but we are too busy rushing towards some future goal to receive the gift. The sound of rain on the roof, the feeling of breath moving in and out of our body, the warmth of sunlight through a window. These are not interruptions to our spiritual practice. They are the practice itself, when met with the kind of listening that Wei learned to cultivate. As your own breathing naturally slows and deepens now, you might notice how each breath has its own sound, its own silence. Like the temple bell, your breath emerges from stillness, exists in stillness, and returns to stillness. There is nothing you need to add to this natural rhythm, nothing you need to fix or improve. Only this, the willingness to listen with your whole being to what is already here. In the rolling hills of ancient China, where morning mist gathered in valleys and stone paths wound between groves of cypress trees, there stood a monastery known for its unusual approach to spiritual training. The monks there were famous not for their speed in reaching enlightenment, but for their extraordinary patience in cultivating wisdom slowly, like farmers tending crops through many seasons. Among these monks lived a young man named Chen who had arrived with great enthusiasm and even greater haste. He had read many texts about Zen practice and felt ready to achieve the profound states of consciousness he had studied. Chen was intelligent and dedicated, but he possessed one quality that would prove both his greatest challenge and his most important teacher. He was always in a hurry. During walking meditation, while the other monks moved with deliberate slowness along the mountain paths, Chen would find himself constantly wanting to walk faster. His legs felt restless. His mind would race ahead to his destination. He would count his steps impatiently, wondering when the walking period would end so he could move on to the next activity. In the meditation hall, Chen would settle onto his cushion and immediately begin trying to achieve the deep states of concentration he had read about. When his mind wandered, he would jerk his attention back to his breath with forceful determination. When peaceful moments arose naturally, he would try to grasp them and make them permanent, which inevitably caused them to disappear. During work periods, Chen would complete his assigned tasks quickly and efficiently, then look around for more work to do. He would finish sweeping his section of the walkway, then offer to help others who were still working on theirs. He meant to be helpful, but the other monks began to feel pressured by his constant motion and urgency. After several months of this restless activity, Chen's teacher, Master Liu, called him for a private meeting. Master Liu was an elderly monk whose movements had the quality of water flowing over stones, unhurried but continuous, gentle but unstoppable. His voice carried the same quality, soft but penetrating, never rushed but always clear. Chen, Master Liu said as they sat in the small garden behind the teacher's quarters, "I have been watching your practice with great interest. You work harder than most students. You study more texts than others. You sit in meditation longer than many monks who have been here for years. Yet something in your approach concerns me." Chen felt a flutter of anxiety. He had been trying so hard to be a good student. "Master, please tell me what I am doing wrong so I can correct it immediately." Master Liu smiled gently. "Your eagerness to correct problems immediately is itself part of the pattern I wish to discuss. Tell me, when you walk the meditation paths, what do you experience?" "I try to stay mindful of each step, Master, but I often find myself wanting to reach the end of the path more quickly. The walking seems to take so long, and I feel like I could be using that time for deeper practices." "And when you sit in meditation?" "I work very hard to concentrate on my breath, but my mind is often agitated. I keep trying to achieve the profound stillness I've read about, but it seems to elude me. I wonder if I need to practice longer or try different techniques." Master Liu nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And tell me, Chen, what do you hope to accomplish through your practice here?" "I want to achieve enlightenment, Master. I want to understand the deepest truths of Zen Buddhism and develop real wisdom, not just intellectual knowledge." "These are worthy aspirations," Master Liu said quietly. "But I wonder if your approach to achieving them might be creating obstacles. Tell me, have you noticed how Brother Ming walks the meditation paths?" Chen thought about Ming, an older monk who had been at the monastery for over 20 years. "He walks very slowly, Master. Sometimes it seems like he's barely moving at all. I often wonder if he's being lazy or if he's having trouble with his legs." "Tomorrow morning," Master Liu said, "I want you to try something different. Instead of walking the path at your usual pace, I want you to walk exactly as Brother Ming walks. Match his speed precisely. Don't try to understand why or judge whether it's useful. Simply experiment with moving at his pace for 1 week." Chen felt frustrated by this instruction. Walking that slowly seemed like a waste of time, a step backward from the intensive practice he had been maintaining. But he respected his teacher and agreed to try the experiment. The next morning, Chen positioned himself behind Brother Ming as they began the walking meditation. Ming's pace was indeed extraordinarily slow. He would lift each foot with deliberate care, place it gently on the ground, pause slightly, then slowly shift his weight forward before lifting the other foot. What usually took Chen 10 minutes now stretched to nearly half an hour. At first, Chen felt almost tortured by the slowness. His mind raced with impatience. He wanted to push past Ming and walk at a normal speed. His legs felt restless and cramped. He kept checking to see how much farther they had to go, counting the minutes until the walking period would end. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. The forced slowness gradually quieted Chen's racing mind. Without the constant goal of reaching his destination, his attention began to settle into the immediate sensations of walking. He started to notice things he had never seen before during his hurried trips along the same paths. He became aware of the way morning light filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak trees that lined the walkway. He noticed how the stone path felt different under his feet in various weather conditions, how the texture changed from dry and rough to smooth and slightly slippery after rain. He began to hear the subtle sounds of the monastery waking up, the distant chanting from the main hall, the whisper of wind through bamboo groves. More surprisingly, Chen discovered that his mind, no longer focused on arriving somewhere else, began to experience moments of genuine stillness. During the slow walking, thoughts would arise and pass away naturally, like clouds drifting across a clear sky. He wasn't fighting with his mind or trying to control it. The rhythm of the walking seemed to settle his mental activity without any effort on his part. After a week of this experiment, Chen met again with Master Liu. The young monk's demeanor had changed noticeably. His usual restless energy had softened into something more grounded and present. "Master," Chen said, "the slow walking has been a revelation. I understand now why Brother Ming moves as he does. The slowness isn't laziness. It's a form of meditation that I never recognized because I was always trying to get somewhere else." "Yes," Master Liu replied. "And what else have you discovered?" "That my impatience was preventing me from receiving what each moment was offering. When I walked quickly, I was always focused on the destination. But when I walked slowly, I began to experience the journey itself. The path became the practice, not just a way to get to the practice." Master Liu nodded approvingly. "This understanding can be applied to all aspects of your spiritual training. Your eagerness to achieve enlightenment quickly has been preventing you from receiving the teachings that are available right now, in this moment, through whatever you are experiencing." Over the following months, Chen began to approach all his activities with this new understanding of patience. During sitting meditation, instead of striving to achieve particular states, he learned to be present with whatever his mind offered. Some sessions were filled with thoughts, others with sleepiness, others with clarity. He stopped judging these variations and began to see each as an opportunity to practice awareness and acceptance. During work periods, Chen discovered that moving slowly and deliberately made even simple tasks become forms of meditation. Sweeping became a dance of careful attention. Preparing food became an exercise in mindfulness. Copying texts became a way of absorbing wisdom through the patient movement of brush and ink. Years later, when Chen had become a teacher himself, he would often share the lesson of the slow walking with his own students. Zen practice, he would explain, is not about racing towards some distant goal of enlightenment. It is about learning to be completely present with whatever is happening right now. The moment you are in is always the perfect moment for awakening, but only if you are patient enough to receive its teaching fully. Chen learned that true patience in Zen practice is not passive waiting, but active presence. It is the willingness to let each moment unfold at its own pace, rather than forcing it to conform to our timeline of spiritual progress. It is the recognition that wisdom develops organically, like a plant growing toward light, and cannot be rushed without damaging the natural process. The path of patience teaches us that spiritual development has its own rhythm, one that is often slower than our eager minds prefer. But when we learn to move at the pace of wisdom rather than the pace of desire, we discover that every step is complete in itself, every breath is sufficient, and every moment contains everything we need for genuine understanding. In a village famous throughout the region for its beautiful pottery, there lived a master craftsman named Yuki, whose work was treasured in temples and homes across the kingdom. His bowls were said to hold water like cupped hands holding moonlight. His teacups brought out flavors that ordinary vessels could never reveal. Collectors would travel for weeks to commission pieces from his skilled hands. Yet Yuki's approach to his craft puzzled many people who came to observe his work. In an age where other potters competed to see who could produce the most pieces in a day, Yuki would make only one bowl at a time. From the preparation of clay to the final glazing, he would focus entirely on that single piece, sometimes for days or even weeks before beginning another. Young potters would visit his workshop expecting to learn efficient techniques for rapid production. Instead, they would find Yuki sitting quietly with a lump of clay, simply holding it, feeling its texture and moisture, sensing its possibilities. He might spend an entire morning this way before ever placing the clay on his potter's wheel. Master Yuki, an eager young student named Hana, asked one day, "Why do you work so slowly?" The potter in the next village can make 10 bowls in the time it takes you to make one. Surely you could serve more people and earn more income if you increased your pace. Yuki continued his gentle work with the clay, his hands moving with the rhythm of someone who had merged completely with his craft. The wheel turned steadily, and the clay rose under his palms like a flower opening to the Sunday. He was quiet for so long that Hana wondered if he had heard her question. Finally, without taking his eyes from the emerging bowl, Yuki spoke softly. "Tell me, Hana, when you eat rice, do you try to swallow your entire meal in one gulp, or do you chew each grain slowly enough to taste its sweetness?" "I chew slowly, of course, Master. Otherwise I would choke and I wouldn't taste anything." "Exactly. And when you walk in a beautiful garden, do you run through as quickly as possible to see everything at once? Or do you move slowly enough to appreciate each flower, each stone, each play of light and shadow?" Hana thought about this. "I suppose I walk slowly in a garden so I can really see what's there." "Yes," Yuki said, his hands continuing their patient dance with the clay. "So tell me, why should the creation of something beautiful be any different? If I try to make 10 bowls quickly, I create 10 objects. But if I make one bowl with complete attention, I create something that carries the quality of that attention within itself." As the days passed, Hana began to understand what Yuki meant. She watched him work with each bowl as if it were the only bowl he would ever create. When centering the clay on the wheel, he would take whatever time was needed to achieve perfect balance. If the clay was not perfectly centered, he would stop, remove it, and begin again rather than continuing with an imperfect foundation. When pulling up the walls of the bowl, Yuki's movements were so slow and steady that Hana could barely detect the progress from moment to moment. Yet, when she looked away and then back after several minutes, she would be amazed at how much the form had developed. The clay seemed to grow under his hands like a living thing reaching toward its perfect shape. Most remarkably, Yuki seemed to enter a state of deep meditation while working. His breathing would slow and deepen. His face would become peaceful and absorbed. The usual sounds of the workshop, the turning of the wheel, the whisper of clay against palms, seemed to create a rhythm that drew both potter and observer into a profound stillness. "Master," Hana asked one afternoon as she watched him carefully trim the foot of a bowl that was nearly finished, "you seem to disappear when you work. Where do you go?" Yuki paused in his trimming and looked up with eyes that held a gentle brightness. "I don't go anywhere, Hana. I come here. When I work quickly, part of my attention is always jumping ahead to the next bowl, the next customer, the next challenge. But when I work slowly enough to be completely present with this clay, this moment, this precise movement of my hands, then I am fully here. And when I am fully here, the clay and I work together rather than against each other." Hana began to experiment with this approach in her own pottery practice. At first, slowing down felt almost painful. Her mind would generate constant thoughts about all the bowls she could be making, all the time she was wasting, all the progress she wasn't making toward mastering the craft. But gradually, she began to discover what Yuki had tried to show her. When she slowed down enough to feel the clay's response to her touch, she could sense when it was ready to be shaped and when it needed to rest. When she paid complete attention to the centering process, her bowls started with a foundation that made all subsequent work easier and more successful. Most importantly, Hannah began to experience the deep satisfaction that came from complete absorption in creative work. Instead of thinking about making pottery, she was simply making pottery. Instead of evaluating her progress, she was engaged in the immediate dialogue between her hands and the clay. Instead of worrying about results, she was participating fully in the process. Over time, Hannah's bowls began to develop a quality that surprised even her. They held their shape with natural grace. Their surfaces invited touch. When people used them for eating or drinking, they seemed to enhance the experience in some subtle but unmistakable way. One day, a wealthy collector visited Yuki's workshop and was shown examples of both the master's work and Hannah's recent pieces. The collector examined each bowl carefully, turning it in the light, running his fingers over the surfaces, testing the balance and proportions. "Master Yuki," the collector said finally, "I can see the extraordinary skill in your bowls. But I am surprised to find that your student's work has something of the same quality. How has she developed such mastery in such a short time?" Yuki smiled and looked at Hannah with obvious pride. "She has learned the secret of making one bowl at a time. When you give your complete attention to one piece, that piece teaches you everything you need to know about making the next piece. But when you try to make many pieces without really making any of them completely, each piece remains a stranger to you." Years later, when Hannah had become a respected potter in her own right, she would share Yuki's teaching with her own students. "People often ask me how to develop speed in pottery," she would explain. "But speed is not something you develop by trying to move quickly. True speed comes from eliminating wasted motion, wasted attention, wasted energy. When you are completely absorbed in what you are doing, when there is no separation between yourself and your work, then you move at exactly the right pace. Not too fast, not too slow, but in harmony with the rhythm of creation itself." The lesson of the patient potter reveals something essential about how mastery develops in any field of endeavor. Whether we are learning meditation, developing artistic skills, building relationships, or simply living our daily lives, the temptation to rush toward results often prevents us from receiving the guidance that each moment offers. Yuki's approach to pottery embodies a principle that Zen Buddhism teaches about all meaningful activity. Complete presence transforms both process and outcome. When we bring our full attention to what we are doing right now, we tap into a quality of awareness that produces results far superior to what scattered, goal-oriented effort can achieve. The young potter Hannah discovered that slowing down actually accelerated her real learning. By taking time to feel the clay's responses, to notice subtle changes in texture and plasticity, to develop sensitivity to the material she was working with, she learned more in months than she might have learned in years of hurried practice. This teaches us that patience in Zen practice is not about accepting slow progress. It is about recognizing that depth of engagement produces more authentic development than surface-level speed. When we try to rush through meditation techniques, we miss the subtle teachings that emerge only when we settle deeply into present experience. The potter's wheel in Yuki's workshop represents the natural rhythm of all creative work. It turns at its own speed, neither hurrying nor delaying. The clay responds to patient hands that move in harmony with this rhythm rather than fighting against it. When potter and wheel and clay work together, beauty emerges effortlessly, like water finding its own level. In your own breath, you can feel this same rhythm. Each inhalation and exhalation happens at exactly the right pace for your body's needs in this moment. You don't need to speed up your breathing to get more oxygen faster. You don't need to slow it down to prove you're relaxed. Your breath knows its own perfect timing, and when you align with that natural rhythm, peace arises spontaneously. The path of patience that both Chen and Hana discovered is always available to us. In walking, we can move slowly enough to feel our connection to the earth beneath our feet. In working, we can give complete attention to each task rather than rushing toward completion. In listening, we can receive words fully before preparing our response. In breathing, we can allow each breath to teach us about the natural rhythm of letting go and receiving. Rest in this patient presence that asks nothing more than your willingness to be here now, breathing naturally, allowing the gentle rhythm of sleep to carry you deeper into the peaceful heart of understanding, where all things find their perfect timing and every moment is complete. Along the banks of a mountain river that carved its way through ancient stone and carried the snowmelt of distant peaks toward the valley below, there lived a man named Jin who had developed an unusual obsession. For over 10 years, he had been collecting river stones, gathering specimens that caught his eye during daily walks along the water's edge. Jin's collection had grown to fill every shelf, basket, and corner of his small cottage. He had smooth stones worn round by centuries of flowing water, angular pieces freshly broken from cliff faces, stones with unusual colors and patterns, and rare specimens with fossils embedded in their surfaces. Each stone had been selected with care, chosen for its unique beauty or interesting characteristics. The collecting had begun innocently enough. Jin had been walking the riverbank one morning when a particularly beautiful blue-grey stone had caught his attention. Its surface was perfectly smooth, polished by countless years of water flow, and it fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. He had brought it home and placed it on his windowsill, where the morning light would illuminate its subtle colors. But one stone had led to another and another. Soon Jin was spending several hours each day searching the riverbank for new additions to his collection. He developed an eye for spotting unusual specimens. He learned to distinguish between different types of rock, to appreciate the various ways water could shape stone, to recognize the geological stories that different patterns told. Jin took great pride in his collection. He would spend evenings arranging and rearranging his stones, creating displays that showed off their various qualities. He built special shelves to house the larger specimens and small boxes lined with soft cloth to protect the more delicate pieces. Visitors would often comment on the beauty of his collection and the obvious care with which it was maintained. But as the years passed, something troubling began to happen. Jin found that his joy in discovering new stones was being overshadowed by anxiety about maintaining his existing collection. He worried about chips and cracks that might develop. He fretted over dust that accumulated despite regular cleaning. He became possessive about his most prized specimens, reluctant to let visitors handle them for fear of damage. More troubling still, Jin noticed that his daily walks along the river had lost much of their peaceful quality. Instead of simply enjoying the sound of flowing water, the play of light on the surface, the way different seasons changed the character of the stream, he was always scanning the shoreline for new stones to add to his collection. His relationship with the river had become acquisitive rather than appreciative. One spring morning, after heavy rains had swollen the river and deposited many new stones along its banks, Jin encountered an old monk sitting quietly by the water's edge. The monk was watching the river flow with obvious pleasure, occasionally tossing small pebbles into the current and smiling as they disappeared beneath the surface. "Good morning, Master," Jin said politely, recognizing the monk's robes. "This is an excellent morning for collecting stones. The high water has brought down many beautiful specimens from upstream." The monk looked up with eyes that held the same clarity as the flowing water beside them. "Yes, the river is very generous with its gifts. But tell me, friend, what do you do with the stones you collect?" Jin felt pleased to share his expertise. "I have a wonderful collection at my cottage. Stones of every type and color, some quite rare. I've been gathering them for over 10 years. Each one has its own place in my displays." "Ah," the monk said with gentle interest. "And do the stones enjoy being in your collection?" Jin felt puzzled by this question. "I'm not sure what you mean, Master. They're just stones, but I take very good care of them. I keep them clean and safe from damage." "I see. And tell me, where were these stones before you collected them?" "Here by the river, of course. They were mixed in with all the ordinary stones that no one notices or appreciates." The monk picked up a small grey pebble from beside his feet and held it up to catch the morning light. "This little stone has been traveling downstream for perhaps centuries, visiting different bends in the river, watching the seasons change, feeling the caress of flowing water every day. Do you think it might miss its journey if someone took it away to keep it safe on a shelf?" Jin considered this perspective, which had never occurred to him. "But Master, surely it's better to preserve beautiful stones than to let them be lost in the river where their beauty goes unnoticed." "Lost?" the monk asked with a small smile. "Or continuing their ancient journey?" He tossed the pebble gently into the flowing water, where it disappeared with a soft splash. "That stone is now traveling to places I will never see, becoming part of landscapes I cannot imagine. Its journey continues." Jin felt a strange pang as he watched the pebble vanish into the current. He had never thought of his collecting as interrupting the stone's natural journey. He had always believed he was saving them, appreciating them in ways that nature could not. "But Master," Jin said, "if I don't collect them, their beauty will be wasted." "No one will see how remarkable they are." The monk gestured toward the flowing water. "Look at this river, friend. Every day, millions of stones travel downstream. Their surfaces catch sunlight, reflect in pools, create patterns as they tumble over small waterfalls. Birds see them. Fish swim among them. The water itself is shaped by their presence. Is this beauty wasted simply because no human eye catalogues and preserves it?" As Jin listened, he began to feel a weight he hadn't noticed before. His cottage full of stones suddenly seemed less like a treasure house and more like a prison where beautiful objects were kept apart from their natural home. For the first time, he wondered if his collecting had been motivated more by his desire to possess beauty than by his love of beauty itself. "Master," Jin asked quietly, "are you saying it's wrong to collect stones?" "I'm asking you to consider whether your stones serve beauty better on your shelves or in their river journey. Only you can answer that question. But I can tell you this. True appreciation often means allowing what we love to be exactly what it is, where it belongs, doing what it was made to do." The monk stood slowly and brushed dust from his robes. "I must continue my own journey now. But before I go, may I ask you something? When you look at this river, what brings you more joy? The stones you might take from it, or the flowing itself?" Jin thought about this question as the monk walked away along the riverbank. He realized that he had been so focused on individual stones that he had stopped really seeing the river as a living, flowing whole. He had been treating it like a treasure box rather than a teacher. That evening, Jin sat in his cottage surrounded by his carefully organized collection. For the first time in years, instead of seeing beautiful objects well cared for, he saw stones separated from their home. He imagined each specimen continuing its journey downstream, tumbling over rapids, settling in quiet pools, gradually wearing smooth in the patient embrace of flowing water. Over the following days, Jin found himself returning to the riverbank, not to search for new stones, but simply to watch the water flow. He began to appreciate the river's constant teaching about impermanence, about the beauty of letting go, about the way all things find their way to where they belong when allowed to move naturally. Gradually, Jin began to understand what the monk had shown him. His love of river stones had grown into attachment to river stones, and this attachment had actually separated him from the very beauty he thought he was preserving. He had been trying to stop time, to hold permanent what was meant to be flowing. After much consideration, Jin made a decision that surprised even himself. On a clear morning when the river ran low and peaceful, he began returning his stones to the water. Not carelessly or with regret, but with gratitude for the time they had spent together and joy for the journeys they would continue. Some stones he placed gently in shallow pools where they could settle slowly back into the river's rhythm. Others he tossed into deeper currents where they could tumble and roll toward distant destinations. Each release felt like a small gift, both to the stone and to himself. The process took many days, but Jin found that instead of feeling loss, he experienced a growing sense of freedom. His cottage became spacious again. His walks along the river returned to being peaceful contemplation rather than acquisitive hunting. He began to see beauty everywhere, not just in objects worth collecting, but in the flowing itself, the constant dance of water and stone that created beauty far greater than any individual specimen. Years later, when people asked Jin about his former collection, he would smile and point to the flowing river. "My collection is still here," he would say. "It's just not standing still anymore. Every day I can visit stones I knew, watch new ones arrive, and appreciate beauty that's alive and moving rather than captured and static. I learned that loving something sometimes means letting it be free to follow its natural way." The Riverstone Collector's story teaches us something profound about the difference between appreciation and attachment in Zen practice. Jin's initial love of beautiful stones was genuine, but it gradually transformed into a need to possess and control that beauty. This transformation separated him from the very source of what he loved. In our spiritual practice, we can fall into similar patterns. We might begin with authentic appreciation for moments of peace or clarity that arise during meditation. But if we try to grasp these experiences, to make them permanent, or to collect them like trophies of our spiritual progress, we move away from the flowing nature of consciousness itself. The monk's teaching about the stone's journey points to a fundamental principle of Zen Buddhism. All phenomena arise, exist for a time, and pass away. This includes our thoughts, emotions, insights, and even our deepest spiritual experiences. When we try to hold on to these experiences, we interrupt their natural flow and create suffering. Jin discovered that true love often means allowing what we cherish to be exactly what it is, moving according to its own nature rather than according to our desires. This applies not only to objects but to people, experiences, and even our own mental states. When we learn to appreciate without grasping, we open ourselves to a much richer and more dynamic relationship with life. The flowing river represents the constant movement of existence itself. Everything is always in the process of becoming something else. The stone that catches our eye today will be different tomorrow, shaped by tonight's flow. The moment of peace we experience in meditation will naturally give way to whatever arises next. This isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be embraced. Let your own awareness flow now like that mountain river, carrying thoughts and sensations downstream without trying to hold on to any particular experience. Notice how much more spacious and peaceful your mind feels when you stop trying to collect and preserve moments and instead allow them to arise and pass naturally, each one perfect in its brief appearance before flowing on to make room for what comes next. In a village where the sound of hammer on anvil rang through the air from dawn until dusk, there lived a blacksmith named Kenzo, whose skill was matched only by his famous temper. His forge produced the finest tools, horseshoes, and decorative ironwork in 3 provinces, but everyone who dealt with him knew to approach with caution when the fire burned hot and the work grew challenging. Kenzo's anger was legendary. When a piece of metal refused to bend to his will, he would curse and strike the anvil with such force that sparks would shower like falling stars. When customers questioned his prices or suggested changes to his designs, his face would redden and his voice would rise until even the bravest villagers would retreat hastily from his shop. When apprentices made mistakes, his shouting could be heard 3 streets away, and more than one young man had fled his training rather than endure the master's volcanic temper. The ironwork that emerged from Kenzo's forge was undeniably beautiful, but it came at a cost that extended beyond the payment in coins. The blacksmith's anger seemed to infect his workspace. Apprentices learned to work in nervous tension. Customers conducted their business quickly and left as soon as possible. Even the quality of the work sometimes suffered when Kenzo's rage caused him to strike too hard or work metal while it was too hot or too cold for proper shaping. For years, this pattern continued. Kenzo's reputation for fine craftsmanship kept customers coming despite his difficult personality, and his anger seemed to be simply part of who he was, as unchangeable as the color of his eyes or the strength of his arms. But one spring day, a young man named Hana came to the village seeking work as an apprentice blacksmith. Hana had trained briefly with a master in a distant town, but that forge had closed when the old smith retired. Now Hana needed to continue learning his trade, and despite the warnings of villagers about Kenzo's temper, he was the only master blacksmith in the region accepting apprentices. Hana was soft-spoken and moved with natural calm, like still water reflecting sky. When he approached Kenzo's forge to request apprenticeship, he bowed respectfully and waited patiently while the master finished shaping a horseshoe. The air around the anvil shimmered with heat, and the rhythmic ringing of hammer on metal filled the workspace. "What do you want?" Kenzo growled without looking up from his work. Sweat streaked his soot-covered face, and his massive arms moved with the precision that came from decades of practice. "Master," Hana said quietly, "I seek to learn the art of working iron. I have some basic training, but I need a skilled teacher to develop real mastery." Kenzo finally looked at the young man, taking in his respectful posture and calm demeanor. Most potential apprentices seemed either too eager or too intimidated. This one appeared neither. "Apprenticeship here is not easy," Kenzo warned. "I demand perfection. I have no patience for lazy workers or slow learners. Many have started and few have finished their training with me." "I understand, Master. I am willing to work hard and learn from whatever instruction you provide." Something in Hana's quiet confidence appealed to Kenzo, though he couldn't have explained why. Against his better judgment, perhaps influenced by the young man's obvious sincerity, he agreed to a trial period. For the first few weeks, Hana worked diligently at the simple tasks assigned to new apprentices. He tended the fire with careful attention to maintaining the proper heat for different types of work. He sorted and organized tools with precision. He observed Kenzo's techniques with focused attention, asking questions only when appropriate and listening to answers without argument or interruption. But inevitably, as Hana began working with heated metal himself, mistakes occurred. The first time he allowed a piece of iron to cool too much before shaping, ruining an hour's work, Kenzo's temper exploded with its usual force. "Fool," the master said, his face darkening with anger. "Were you sleeping? Can't you see when iron loses its working heat? Now we must start over because of your carelessness." The other apprentices in the shop tensed, waiting for Hana to cringe or make excuses, or perhaps flee as others had done. But something unexpected happened. Hana absorbed Kenzo's anger like earth absorbing rain. He didn't shrink away or defend himself. He didn't argue or make excuses. Instead, he bowed deeply and said simply, "Yes, Master. I see my mistake clearly now. Thank you for showing me what I failed to observe." There was something in Hana's response that took the wind out of Kenzo's rage. The young man wasn't being sarcastic or submissive. He seemed genuinely grateful for the correction, despite its harsh delivery. More puzzling still, he showed no fear or resentment, only sincere attention to learning from his error. As weeks passed, this pattern repeated. When Hana made mistakes, which all apprentices do, Kenzo would explode with his characteristic fury. But each time, Hana would receive the anger with perfect calm, acknowledge his error honestly, and demonstrate through his actions that he had learned from the correction. Something remarkable began to happen. Kenzo found that his anger, which usually fed on fear or defensiveness in others, had nothing to sustain it when directed at Hana. The young man's responses were like throwing oil on water instead of on fire. Instead of igniting greater fury, they created a strange kind of stillness. Other people in the forge began to notice the change. When Kenzo shouted at Hana, the apprentice's calm somehow affected the entire workspace. Instead of everyone becoming more tense, there was an odd sense of peace that settled over the shop. It was as if Hana's serenity had a quality that absorbed anger rather than reflecting it back. Gradually, almost without realizing it, Kenzo found himself shouting less frequently at Hana than at the other apprentices. It wasn't that the young man made fewer mistakes. Rather, his responses to correction made anger seem unnecessary, even counterproductive. One evening, after a particularly challenging day when several complex projects had required careful attention, Kenzo asked Hana to remain after the other apprentices had left. "Young man," the master said, "I've been observing your responses to correction, and they puzzle me. When I shout at the others, they become defensive or frightened. When I shout at you, you seem almost grateful. Why is this?" Hana considered the question carefully before answering. "Master, when you show anger about my mistakes, I understand that you care about the quality of the work and about my learning. Your anger shows me exactly where I need to pay more attention. It's like a clear signal pointing to what needs improvement. But doesn't my anger make you feel bad about yourself?" "No, Master. Your anger is about the work, not about me as a person. You become angry when iron is worked incorrectly, when fire is managed poorly, when techniques are applied carelessly. These are all things I can learn to do better. Your anger helps me see clearly what needs to change." Kenzo was quiet for a long time, staring into the glowing coals of the forge. Finally he asked, "What do you see when you look at my anger?" "I see a master craftsman who cares deeply about his art. I see someone who has high standards because he knows what excellent work looks like. I see a teacher who uses whatever methods are necessary to help his students learn properly. And you feel no resentment when I shout at you?" Hana shook his head. "How can I resent someone for trying to teach me? When you point out my mistakes with strong emotion, it helps me remember the corrections more clearly than gentle suggestions might. Your anger serves the learning." This conversation marked a turning point in Kenzo's understanding of his own temperament. Over the following months, he began to notice that his anger seemed to have different effects depending on how it was received. When apprentices responded with fear or defensiveness, his anger grew stronger and more destructive. When Hana received it as information about the work rather than as personal attack, the anger served its purpose quickly and dissolved naturally. More remarkably, Kenzo began to discover that he had a choice about how he expressed his passionate care for craftsmanship. Watching Hana's consistent calm in the face of criticism made the master more aware of his own emotional patterns. He realized that his anger often had more to do with his own frustration and impatience than with the mistakes of his apprentices. Gradually, Kenzo found himself speaking more directly about errors without needing to shout. When he did feel anger rising, he could express it more skillfully, focusing on the specific problem rather than attacking the person who had made the mistake. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Other apprentices noticed the change and began trying to respond to corrections more like Hana did. The entire atmosphere of the forge became more conducive to learning. Mistakes became opportunities for instruction rather than occasions for fear. Work improved not only because apprentices were less nervous, but because they were more willing to ask questions and seek guidance when uncertain. Years later, when Hana had become a skilled blacksmith himself and was preparing to establish his own forge, Kenzo shared with him what he had learned through their relationship. "You taught me something I had never understood about anger," the master said. "I thought anger was simply part of my nature, something I had no control over. But watching your responses showed me that anger is like fire in the forge. It can be destructive if not properly directed, but when channeled skillfully, it can serve the work rather than damaging it." Hana smiled with the same calm presence he had always shown. "Master, you taught me that emotions in others are not obstacles to avoid, but information to understand. Your anger was never my enemy. It was your way of caring made visible. When I stopped taking it personally and started receiving it as guidance, it became one of my most valuable teachers." The story of Kenzo and Hana illustrates something profound about how we experience the emotions of others and how our responses can either amplify or transform the emotional climate around us. Hana's approach to his master's anger demonstrates the Zen principle of receiving whatever arises without adding our own reactivity to it. Most people, when faced with another person's anger, respond with either fear or counter-anger. Both responses create a cycle of escalation where emotions feed on each other and grow stronger. Fear validates anger by suggesting that it's dangerous and powerful. Counter-anger creates conflict by meeting fire with fire. But Hana discovered a third way, receiving anger as information rather than as threat. By understanding that Kenzo's outbursts reflected his passionate care for craftsmanship rather than personal hostility, Hana could respond to the content of the emotion rather than being overwhelmed by its intensity. This skill of emotional alchemy, transforming the energy of difficult emotions through the quality of our response, is central to Zen practice. It requires both courage and wisdom. Courage to remain open when faced with intensity, and wisdom to see clearly what is actually happening beneath surface reactions. Hana's responses also changed Kenzo by showing him his own emotional patterns reflected in another person's calmness. When someone receives our emotions without reactivity, we can see them more clearly ourselves. The mirror of another person's peace allows us to recognize when our emotions are serving their purpose and when they are simply creating unnecessary turbulence. This teaching extends beyond dealing with other people's anger to all the emotional currents we encounter in daily life. Whether facing criticism, praise, disappointment, or excitement from others, we can practice receiving these energies without immediately adding our own reactions to them. In this space of clear reception, we can respond more skillfully rather than simply reacting automatically. The transformation that occurred in Kenzo's forge demonstrates how individual practices of emotional clarity can affect entire environments. When one person in a situation maintains genuine equanimity, it creates space for everyone to respond more wisely. Hana's calmness didn't suppress or deny the intensity of emotions present, but it prevented that intensity from spiraling into destructiveness. In the ancient forests of the high mountains, where morning mist clung to valleys and the air was thin and clear, there grew two trees side by side that had witnessed the changing of countless seasons. One was a massive oak, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands could not encircle it, its branches reaching toward the sky with the confidence of something that had never known defeat. The other was a willow, slender and graceful, its long branches hanging like curtains of green silk that swayed with every breath of wind. For over 100 years, these 2 trees had grown together, sharing the same soil, drinking from the same mountain streams, reaching toward the same Sunday. Travelers would often rest in their shade and marvel at the contrast between them. The oak stood like a fortress of wood and bark, solid and unchanging season after season. The willow danced constantly, its flexible branches moving in patterns that seemed almost like gestures of greeting to each passing cloud and bird. The oak took quiet pride in its strength and stability. Through decades of storms, it had stood unmoved, while weaker trees around the forest had fallen or broken. Its deep roots anchored it firmly in the rocky mountain soil. Its thick branches could support the weight of snow, the force of wind, the nests of eagles. Nothing in nature could bend it against its will. The willow, by contrast, bent with every breeze. Its branches would sweep low during windstorms, sometimes touching the ground before springing back toward the sky. In winter, heavy snow would bow its limbs until they nearly broke, yet somehow they always returned to their natural positions when the weight was removed. The willow seemed to have no fixed shape, changing its form constantly in response to whatever forces moved around it. For many years, the relationship between the trees was harmonious. They shared the clearing peacefully, each following its own nature without interfering with the other. The oak provided steady shelter for small animals and birds who needed reliable protection. The willow offered graceful beauty and gentle shade for creatures who appreciated movement and change. But as both trees grew larger with the passing decades, their different approaches to meeting life's challenges became more apparent. The oak grew not only taller but broader, its branches extending farther from its trunk, creating more impressive displays of strength and permanence. The willow grew more flexible with age, its branches becoming longer and more responsive to the slightest changes in air currents. One autumn, when both trees were in their prime maturity, the mountain region experienced the most severe storm in living memory. Winds descended from the high peaks with a force that had not been seen for generations. Rain fell in sheets so dense that the forest became almost dark during daylight hours. The storm lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, testing every living thing in its path. On the first day, the oak stood firm against the wind's assault. Its massive trunk remained perfectly vertical, while its strong branches held their positions with only minor movement. The tree took satisfaction in its ability to resist the storm's power, feeling confirmation of the wisdom of its approach to life. Strength against strength, will against will, it would not be moved. The willow responded to the storm completely differently. From the moment the first strong gusts arrived, its branches began their dance of accommodation. They would bend low when the wind pushed against them, then rise again when the pressure eased. Sometimes the branches would sweep almost horizontal to the ground, moving with the wind rather than fighting it. The tree seemed to be having a conversation with the storm, responding to each of its demands while maintaining its own essential nature. On the second day, the storm's intensity increased beyond anything the forest had ever experienced. Winds howled through the trees with sounds like the voices of mountain spirits in rage. Rain mixed with hail struck the forest with violence that damaged bark and stripped leaves from even the hardiest trees. The oak met this greater challenge with greater resistance. It stood like a monument to the power of strength and determination, refusing to bend even a degree from its upright position. Its branches, thick and rigid, held their angles against the wind's attempts to move them. Every fiber of the tree's being was committed to proving that force could be met with greater force, that the storm would break against its unwillingness to yield. The willow continued its flowing response to each change in the wind's direction and intensity. Its branches moved in patterns that seemed almost like water flowing around obstacles. When the wind pressed from one direction, the branches would yield completely, then spring back when the pressure shifted. The tree absorbed the storm's energy rather than opposing it, channeling the wind's force through its flexible structure rather than trying to block it. On the third day, the storm reached its peak intensity. Winds that had been strong became overwhelming. Sounds that had been loud became deafening. Throughout the forest, trees that had stood for decades began to fall. Even some of the largest and most established giants, trees that had weathered countless previous storms, began to crack and topple under forces beyond their ability to resist. The oak faced this ultimate test with all the strength it had developed over a century of growth. Its roots, deep and strong, gripped the rocky soil with desperate power. Its trunk, massive and rigid, stood against the wind like a tower defying earthquake. Its branches, thick as smaller trees, maintained their positions through sheer, stubborn strength. But the storm's power had grown beyond what even the mightiest resistance could withstand. As the oak continued to meet force with force, stress began to accumulate in its rigid structure. The very strength that had served it so well in smaller storms became a liability when faced with forces greater than its ability to resist. The tree could not bend, so it began to break. First, smaller branches started to crack under the constant pressure. Then larger limbs began to split, where they joined the trunk. The oak's commitment to maintaining its shape, its refusal to yield even slightly, meant that when the storm's power exceeded its resistance, it had no way to accommodate the overwhelming force. During the height of the third night, with a sound like thunder that shook the entire mountain, the great oak finally broke. Its massive trunk snapped halfway up its height, and the ancient tree came crashing down with its branches still extended, still rigid, still trying to maintain the shape it had held for over 100 years. The willow, meanwhile, continued its graceful dance with the storm's fury. Its branches swept the ground repeatedly, sometimes lying flat for minutes at a time as the wind pressed them down with irresistible force. But each time the pressure eased even slightly, the flexible branches would spring back toward their natural position, ready to bend again when the next gust arrived. The willow's strategy of accommodation allowed it not only to survive the storm, but to do so without major damage. By working with the wind rather than against it, by yielding when yield was necessary and recovering when recovery was possible, the tree channeled the storm's energy harmlessly through its flexible structure. When morning came and the storm finally exhausted itself, the forest revealed the results of nature's test. Throughout the woodland, rigid trees lay fallen, their trunks snapped, or their root systems torn from the ground. The massive oak, despite its century of strength and its deep roots, lay in pieces among the other casualties of inflexibility. But the willow stood intact, its branches once again swaying gently in the calm morning breeze. Its trunk was unmarked, its root system undisturbed. The tree that had appeared most fragile, most vulnerable to the storm's power, had proven to be the most enduring when faced with forces beyond the capacity of mere strength to resist. Years later, as new trees grew around the willow and the fallen oak gradually returned to the soil that had nourished it, forest creatures would tell the story of the great storm to their offspring. The tale became a teaching about two different approaches to meeting overwhelming challenges and the sometimes surprising results of flexibility versus rigidity. The willow, now the elder tree of its clearing, continued to dance with every breeze, teaching by example that true strength sometimes lies not in the ability to resist all forces, but in the wisdom to yield when yielding serves survival, and to spring back when conditions allow recovery. The teaching of the oak and willow speaks to one of the most practical applications of Zen wisdom in daily life. Both trees possessed admirable qualities, and both approaches had served them well for many years. The oak's strength and stability provided valuable gifts to the forest ecosystem. The willow's grace and flexibility offered different but equally important contributions. The distinction became crucial only when both approaches were tested by forces greater than either tree had previously encountered. In such extreme conditions, the qualities that had been assets could become liabilities if applied inflexibly. The oak's commitment to never yielding, its identity built on unchanging resistance, left it with no options when resistance was insufficient. This pattern appears frequently in human experience. Personality traits, strategies, or approaches that serve us well under normal circumstances can become sources of suffering when we encounter situations that exceed their capacity. Determination becomes stubbornness when flexibility would serve better. Independence becomes isolation when connection is needed. Confidence becomes rigidity when humility would enable learning. The willow's approach demonstrates what Zen teachings describe as skillful means or adaptive wisdom. Rather than committing to any fixed strategy, the willow responded appropriately to whatever conditions arose. When gentle breezes called for graceful swaying, it swayed gracefully. When fierce winds demanded complete yielding, it yielded completely. When calm returned, it resumed its natural posture. This flexibility requires a different kind of strength than the oak's resistance-based approach. The willow needed the resilience to bend without breaking, the patience to endure periods of being pressed flat, and the vitality to recover repeatedly from extreme positions. Most importantly, it needed the wisdom to recognize when accommodation served better than resistance. In human terms, this translates to developing the capacity to respond freshly to each situation rather than applying the same approach regardless of conditions. Sometimes we need the oak's strength and stability. Sometimes we need the willow's flexibility and adaptability. Wisdom lies in recognizing which approach serves best in any given moment. The story also teaches about the nature of true durability. The oak's approach aimed at permanent strength, building structures that could resist any force indefinitely. The willow's approach accepted temporary vulnerability in service of long-term survival. By allowing itself to be moved and shaped by forces beyond its control, it preserved its essential life and capacity for growth. This principle applies to spiritual practice as well as practical life skills. Meditation traditions that insist on rigid adherence to specific techniques may provide stability for practitioners who need structure, but they can become obstacles when life demands different responses. Approaches that emphasize adaptability and responsiveness to changing conditions may seem less systematic, but often prove more sustainable when faced with the varied challenges of long-term practice. Let your own breathing now reflect the willow's wisdom. Notice how each breath adapts naturally to your body's changing needs, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, always responsive to present conditions rather than following any fixed pattern. This natural flexibility of breath can teach your mind the same adaptive responsiveness that allowed the willow to survive while more rigid structures fell. In a village where many people suffered from various ailments and injuries, there lived a woman named May, who had developed a reputation as an extraordinary healer. People would travel from neighboring towns to seek her help with conditions that other physicians had been unable to cure. Yet, those who came expecting to find someone practicing elaborate medical techniques or dispensing exotic remedies were often surprised by what they encountered. May's healing practice involved no medicines, no herbs, no needles or instruments of any kind. Her treatment room contained only simple cushions arranged around a low table where tea was served. When patients came to her, she would invite them to sit comfortably and share tea while they talked about whatever concerns had brought them to seek her help. At first, many visitors assumed that the tea drinking was preliminary to the real treatment, which would surely involve some kind of medical intervention. They would describe their symptoms and wait for May to prescribe remedies or perform therapeutic procedures. Instead, she would continue serving tea and listening with complete attention to whatever her guests wished to share. Master May, patients would sometimes ask, "When will the healing treatment begin?" She would smile gently and reply, "What do you think might be happening right now?" Most people found this response puzzling. They could see that nothing special was taking place. They were simply drinking tea and having conversation with a kind woman who listened carefully to what they said. Yet somehow, many patients discovered that they felt better after spending time with May than they had after more conventional treatments with other healers. A young physician named Dr. Takeshi, who had studied medicine in the capital city and prided himself on his knowledge of the latest treatment methods, became curious about May's unusual approach. He had heard reports of people being helped by her practice, but he couldn't understand how conversation and tea could address serious medical conditions. Dr. Takeshi decided to observe May's methods by visiting her under the pretense of seeking treatment for headaches that had been troubling him. He was skeptical about her approach, but curious enough to investigate whether there might be some technique he was overlooking. When he arrived at May's simple healing room, she greeted him with warmth and invited him to sit on one of the comfortable cushions. She prepared tea with careful attention, warming the cups, measuring the leaves precisely, and pouring the hot water with graceful movements that seemed almost ceremonial. "Tell me about these headaches," she said as she offered him a cup of the fragrant tea. "When do they usually occur? What does the pain feel like? How long have you been experiencing them?" Dr. Takeshi described his symptoms in clinical terms, expecting that this information would lead to questions about his medical history or suggestions for treatment approaches. Instead, May listened with such complete attention that he found himself sharing more personal details than he had intended. He mentioned that the headaches had begun shortly after he opened his medical practice. He described the pressure he felt to cure every patient who came to him. He talked about his frustration when conventional treatments failed to help people who were clearly suffering. He found himself discussing his own doubts about his abilities as a physician. As he spoke, Dr. Takeshi noticed something surprising. The tension in his shoulders, which he had been carrying for months, began to relax. The knot of worry in his stomach started to loosen. Even his headache, which had been building throughout the morning, seemed to ease. "What are you doing?" he asked May. "I can feel something changing in my body, but I don't understand what treatment you're providing." "What do you think is happening?" she asked again, refilling his teacup with the same careful attention she had shown throughout their conversation. Dr. Takeshi tried to analyze the situation medically. "You're not giving me any medicine. You're not manipulating my body or using any therapeutic techniques I can identify. You're just listening to me." "Yes," May said simply. "And how does it feel to be listened to completely?" Dr. Takeshi considered this question seriously. "It feels relieving. Like I can stop carrying all these concerns by myself. Like my problems are being held by someone other than just me. And when you're not carrying all that tension alone, what happens to your body?" It relaxes, he realized. The physical symptoms ease when the mental and emotional pressure decreases. Over the following months, Dr. Takeshi began incorporating some of May's approaches into his own medical practice. He discovered that many patients responded as much to being truly heard and understood as they did to pharmaceutical interventions. He started spending more time listening to the whole person rather than just focusing on specific symptoms. He also noticed that his own stress levels decreased when he approached medicine less as a battle against disease and more as a process of supporting people's natural healing capacities. The pressure he had felt to single-handedly cure every condition was replaced by a sense of partnership with his patient's own recovery processes. One day, after observing May's practice for over a year, Dr. Takeshi asked her to explain the principles behind her healing approach. "Many illnesses," May said, "have roots in the isolation and disconnection people feel. When someone is struggling with pain or disease, they often carry additional suffering from feeling alone with their problems. They believe no one really understands what they're experiencing." She paused to refill their teacups, a ritual that had become familiar and comforting to Dr. Takeshi. When people feel truly heard and understood, their nervous systems can relax. When they don't have to carry their burdens entirely alone, energy that was bound up in worry and tension becomes available for healing. But surely this doesn't work for all conditions, Dr. Takeshi protested. Some illnesses require specific medical interventions. You're absolutely right, May agreed. I always encourage people to seek appropriate medical care for serious conditions. But I've noticed that almost every healing process is supported when people feel seen and held by genuine caring attention. Dr. Takeshi thought about his own experience. The headaches that had brought him to May had indeed responded to conventional treatments, but they had always returned. The relief he found through feeling understood and less alone with his concerns had proven more lasting than any medicine he had tried. Is this a medical technique, he asked, or is it just being human? May smiled. What's the difference? Medicine works best when it includes the full humanity of both the healer and the person being healed. Technical skill is important, but it becomes most effective when it's applied within relationships of genuine care and understanding. Over the years that followed, Dr. Takeshi developed a practice that combined his medical training with the listening skills he had learned from observing May. Patients began to comment that they felt better even before receiving treatment, simply from the experience of having their concerns heard completely. He also noticed that his own satisfaction with medicine increased dramatically. Instead of feeling burdened by the responsibility of curing everyone, he could focus on serving each person's healing process with whatever combination of technical skill and human presence seemed most appropriate. Years later, when younger physicians would ask Dr. Takeshi about his unusually successful practice, he would often tell them about the woman who healed with tea and attention. I learned that the most powerful medicine is often the simplest, he would explain. People heal better when they don't feel alone with their suffering. Sometimes the most therapeutic thing you can offer is your complete presence and genuine care. When May grew old and could no longer maintain her formal healing practice, many people in the village continued to visit her just to share tea and conversation. They came not because they needed medical treatment, but because they had learned that being truly seen and heard was itself a form of nourishment that supported their overall well-being. The story of May the healer illustrates how gentleness and presence can be more powerful than force or technique in addressing human suffering. Her approach worked not because she possessed special medical knowledge or extraordinary abilities, but because she understood something fundamental about the nature of healing. Most illness and emotional suffering is compounded by the isolation people feel when struggling with problems. Physical pain becomes more intense when combined with the anxiety of facing it alone. Emotional difficulties become overwhelming when people believe no one can understand their experience. Even minor problems can feel major when carried without support. May's tea ceremony created a space where people could set down the additional burden of carrying their problems in isolation. This didn't necessarily cure their conditions, but it often reduced the total amount of suffering they experienced and freed energy for their natural healing processes to work more effectively. Dr. Takeshi's integration of listening skills into conventional medical practice demonstrates how gentleness can enhance, rather than replace, more direct interventions. The presence and understanding that May offered didn't compete with medical treatments, but created conditions where those treatments could work more effectively. This principle applies beyond healing to all forms of helping and problem solving. Whether we're supporting friends through difficult times, teaching students who are struggling, or working with challenging situations in our own lives, approaches that include genuine presence and understanding often accomplish more than techniques that rely purely on expertise or force. The gentle way that both the willow and May embodied requires a different kind of strength than approaches based on resistance or intervention. It requires the confidence to trust natural processes, the patience to allow healing and growth to happen at their own pace, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most helpful action is the creation of supportive conditions rather than direct manipulation. In Zen practice, this translates to trusting the mind's natural capacity for awareness and peace, rather than trying to force enlightenment through aggressive techniques. Like May with her patience, we can create conditions that support awakening by cultivating presence, patience, and gentle attention to whatever arises in our experience. The willow and the healer both teach us that true effectiveness often comes from working with natural forces rather than against them, from supporting inherent capacities rather than imposing external solutions, and from responding appropriately to conditions rather than applying the same approach regardless of circumstances. Let your practice now embody this gentle way. Instead of trying to force your mind into special states, simply offer it the gift of kind attention. Instead of wrestling with whatever thoughts or sensations arise, practice receiving them with the same welcoming presence that May offered her visitors. Notice how this gentle acceptance creates conditions where peace can arise naturally, like healing emerging in the space of genuine care and understanding. In a remote valley, where winters lasted half the year and snow often covered the ground from the first frost until late spring, there lived a farmer named Rio, whose approach to agriculture puzzled and sometimes worried his neighbors. While other farmers in the region followed the traditional cycle of planting in spring, tending through summer, and harvesting in autumn, Rio had developed the unusual habit of doing much of his most important work during the coldest, seemingly least productive months of the year. Every winter, while other farmers rested indoors or worked on repairing tools and buildings, Rio could be seen walking slowly through his snow-covered fields. He would carry a leather pouch filled with seeds, and at regular intervals he would stop, brush away the snow, and plant seeds directly into the frozen ground. To observers, this looked like either madness or a complete waste of valuable seeds. Rio, his neighbor Kenji, would say, watching from his warm farmhouse, "What can you hope to accomplish by planting in frozen soil? Those seeds will never survive the winter. You're throwing away resources that could be used properly in the spring." Rio would pause in his work, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and reply gently, "Perhaps. But I have learned that some seeds need the winter to become what they are meant to be." This cryptic response only deepened his neighbor's conviction that Rio had developed some peculiar ideas about farming that went against all common sense and tradition. They would shake their heads and return to their warm houses, leaving the strange farmer to his winter planting. But Rio's approach was based on careful observation and years of experimentation. He had noticed that certain wildflowers and edible plants that grew abundantly in the valley's meadows never appeared in areas that were consistently cultivated according to conventional methods. These plants seemed to require exposure to winter's freeze and thaw cycles to germinate properly. Through patient trial and experimentation, Rio had discovered that many valuable plants needed what botanists call stratification, a process where seeds must experience cold temperatures for extended periods before they can sprout. The winter's freeze would break down tough seed coats, and the alternating cycles of freezing and thawing would prepare the seeds for vigorous growth when warm weather finally arrived. More importantly, Rio had observed that plants grown from seeds that had weathered entire winters in the ground developed root systems of extraordinary depth and strength. They seemed better able to survive drought, more resistant to diseases and more productive over the long term than plants grown from seeds that had been protected from winter's challenges. As years passed, other farmers began to notice that Rio's fields produced abundant harvests even during difficult growing seasons when their own crops struggled. His plants seemed to thrive in conditions that stressed more conventionally grown varieties. His root vegetables grew larger and kept better through the winter storage months. His grain crops stood strong against winds that flattened other farmers' wheat and barley. Still, few of Rio's neighbors were willing to risk valuable seeds on what seemed like an unreasonable practice. The logic of planting in frozen ground, of deliberately exposing seeds to winter's harshness, ran counter to every instinct about protecting valuable resources and nurturing growth under optimal conditions. One particularly harsh winter, when temperatures dropped lower than anyone could remember and snow accumulated deeper than usual, even Rio began to wonder if his winter planting might have limits. As he walked his rounds through the buried fields, placing seeds in ground so frozen it rang like stone when tapped, he questioned whether he was asking too much of nature's processes. But when spring finally arrived and the snow melted to reveal the winter's work, Rio's fields exploded into growth with a vigor that amazed even him. The seeds that had survived the harsh winter emerged as incredibly strong seedlings that quickly established themselves and began rapid development. Plants that normally took weeks to germinate after spring planting were already several inches tall, while his neighbors were just beginning their seeding. That autumn brought the most abundant harvest anyone in the valley had ever seen from Rio's land. The contrast with neighboring farms was so dramatic that other farmers could no longer dismiss his methods as eccentric folly. A few brave experimenters asked Rio to teach them his winter planting techniques. The secret, Rio explained to his first students as they walked through his snow-covered fields, is understanding that some seeds are designed to endure hardship. The winter doesn't destroy them. It prepares them. The cold and darkness that seem hostile are actually necessary for their transformation. He paused beside a small mound where he had planted bean seeds the previous month. These seeds are sleeping now, but they're not idle. The winter is teaching them patience, strengthening their capacity to burst forth when conditions become favorable. If I planted them in the warm greenhouse, they would sprout quickly, but remain weak. The winter gives them power they cannot develop in comfort. One of his students, a young farmer named Hiro, asked, "But how do you know which seeds need winter and which ones should be protected from it?" "Experience teaches you," Rio replied, "but there are signs you can learn to recognize. Seeds with very hard coats usually benefit from freeze-thaw cycles. Plants that grow wild in harsh conditions often need to experience those conditions as seeds. Seeds from plants that live many years tend to be stronger than seeds from plants that complete their life cycle in a single season." As more farmers began experimenting with winter planting, they discovered that Rio's methods required not only courage to plant in seemingly impossible conditions, but also patience to wait for results that might not appear for many months. The traditional cycle of spring planting offered the satisfaction of seeing immediate results. Winter planting required faith in processes that remained invisible until the proper time for their manifestation. Some of the new practitioners became discouraged during their first winter, especially when harsh weather made them doubt that anything could survive such conditions. But those who persisted through their initial doubts were rewarded with unusually strong and productive plants that validated their willingness to trust in nature's deeper wisdom. Over time, the valley developed a reputation for producing unusually resilient crops and high-quality seeds. Farmers from other regions would come to purchase seed stock that had been strengthened through winter planting, taking back to their own lands the benefits of Rio's patient cultivation methods. Years later, when Rio had become an old man and his unusual techniques had become accepted wisdom in the valley, he would often reflect on what his plants had taught him about the conditions necessary for real strength and lasting productivity. People often assume he would tell visitors to his farm that growth happens best under comfortable conditions. They think seeds should be planted in warm soil, protected from harsh weather, given everything they need to sprout quickly and easily. This approach works for many purposes, but it doesn't produce the strongest plants. He would gesture toward his fields, where plants grown from winter-sown seeds stood tall and healthy despite drought conditions that had stressed other crops in the region. These plants learned patience and resilience during their first winter. They developed deep roots because they had to search for life beneath the frozen ground. They became strong because they had to survive conditions that would kill weaker varieties. The winter was not their enemy. It was their teacher. The story of Rio and his winter planting reveals something profound about how genuine strength and wisdom develop in human experience. Like the seeds that needed exposure to winter's challenges to reach their full potential, our own deepest capacities often emerge through encountering and surviving difficulties that initially seem harsh or unwelcome. In Zen practice, we often prefer the warmth and comfort of peaceful meditation sessions, clear insights, and moments of transcendent understanding. These experiences are valuable and nourishing. But the practitioners who develop the most stable and enduring wisdom are often those who have learned to work with the difficult periods as well as the easy ones. When meditation feels forced or distracted, when spiritual insights seem absent, when practice becomes challenging rather than comforting, we can remember Rio's seeds sleeping beneath the winter snow. These difficulties are not obstacles to awakening, but often the very conditions that prepare consciousness for deeper and more lasting transformation. The winter planting teaches us that some valuable developments require what appears to be dormant or unproductive time. The seeds that Rio planted in frozen ground remained invisible for months, showing no signs of growth or progress. But during this apparent inactivity, crucial changes were happening that would later enable extraordinary vitality and resilience. In our spiritual development, we may experience periods when practice seems to produce no visible results, when understanding feels stagnant, when progress appears to have stopped entirely. These winter seasons of inner life can be as necessary as the obvious growing times, preparing us for breakthroughs that require the deep preparation that only patient endurance can provide. The farmer's discovery that winter-planted seeds developed superior root systems also applies to human growth. Wisdom that develops through encountering challenges tends to be more deeply rooted than understanding that comes only through favorable conditions. Compassion that emerges from working with our own suffering reaches deeper than sympathy based purely on philosophical ideals. Let your own practice now embrace this teaching about the seeds of wisdom. Allow whatever difficulties you encounter in meditation, in daily life, or in your spiritual journey to be like Rio's winter soil, not obstacles to growth, but the very conditions that can strengthen your capacity for genuine transformation. Trust that periods of apparent dormancy or struggle may be preparing you for developments that would be impossible without this patient preparation. In the mountains of ancient Japan, where monasteries clung to steep cliffs and the sound of temple bells echoed across deep valleys, there lived a young monk named Daisuke, whose hunger for spiritual knowledge seemed as vast as the sky itself. From the moment he arrived at the monastery, Daisuke approached his teachers with an endless stream of questions about every aspect of Zen practice, Buddhist philosophy, and the nature of enlightenment. "Master," he would ask during morning teachings, "what is the difference between meditation and contemplation? How many different types of awareness are there? Which breathing technique produces the fastest results? What are the stages of spiritual development? How can I know when I'm making progress?" His questions were sincere and intelligent, reflecting genuine curiosity about the deepest matters of existence. But they came in such quantity and with such rapid-fire intensity that his teachers often found themselves spending entire sessions just responding to Daisuke's inquiries, leaving little time for the quiet contemplation that was traditionally the heart of monastic education. After evening meditation, when other monks would sit peacefully or walk slowly through the temple gardens, Daisuke would pursue his teachers with more questions. "Master, I've been thinking about your explanation of non-attachment, but I'm confused about how it differs from detachment. Also, could you explain the relationship between emptiness and compassion? And what exactly did the third patriarch mean when he wrote about the perfect way?" The monks' meals, which were traditionally eaten in silence to cultivate mindfulness and inner quiet, became opportunities for Daisuke to whisper urgent questions to his fellow students. "Do you think our meditation this morning was successful? What criteria should I use to evaluate my concentration? Have you experienced the state of no mind that the texts describe?" Daisuke's teachers initially tried to satisfy his curiosity by providing detailed answers to his questions. They would explain different meditation techniques, outline various philosophical positions, and recommend texts that addressed his specific interests. But they gradually noticed that each answer seemed to generate 3 new questions, and Daisuke's understanding didn't appear to deepen despite all the information he was accumulating. After several months of this pattern, Master Enlighten, the elderly abbot of the monastery, called Daisuke for a private meeting. The young monk arrived with a notebook full of questions he had been saving for just such an opportunity. "Master," Daisuke began eagerly, "I'm so grateful for this chance to clarify some points that have been puzzling me. First, I wanted to ask about the relationship between—" "Stop," Master Yoshida said gently but firmly. "Before you ask me anything, I want you to answer a question for me." Daisuke set down his notebook and gave his teacher full attention, expecting some profound inquiry about philosophical matters. "Tell me," Master Yoshida said, "what color is the teacup on my desk?" Daisuke looked at the simple clay cup that sat beside the master's elbow. "It's brown, Master. A warm brown color, like autumn leaves." "Good. And how does the morning air feel on your skin right now?" Daisuke paused, noticing for the first time the cool breeze that was flowing through the open window. "It feels cool and fresh, Master. Clean, like mountain air after rain." "Excellent. And what sound do you hear most clearly in this moment?" Daisuke listened carefully. Beneath the distant sound of chanting from the main hall, he could hear water trickling from the fountain in the courtyard garden. "I hear water flowing, Master." "From the fountain outside?" Master Yoshida nodded approvingly. "Now tell me, Daisuke, how many questions did you need to ask in order to see the teacup's color, feel the morning air, and hear the sound of flowing water?" Daisuke considered this carefully. "None, Master. Those things were already present. I just needed to pay attention to them." "Yes. And how much philosophical understanding was required for you to have these experiences?" "None, Master. They were direct experiences, not concepts or theories. Exactly. Master Yoshida leaned forward slightly. Now, can you tell me why someone who can see, hear, and feel so clearly needs 10,000 questions about the nature of reality? This inquiry struck Daisuke like a bell awakening him from sleep. He realized that, in his eagerness to understand everything intellectually, he had been overlooking the immediate reality that was constantly available to his direct experience. "Master," he said slowly, "I think I've been trying to think my way into understanding things that can only be experienced directly." "Yes. And what has been the result of all your questioning?" Daisuke reflected on the months he had spent accumulating answers to his endless inquiries. "I have a lot of information, but I don't feel any more at peace or any clearer about how to actually live wisely." "The mind that asks constant questions," Master Yoshida observed, "is like a cup that is always being filled but never allowed to be drunk from. How can you taste the tea if you're too busy asking about its temperature, its flavor, its origin, and its preparation?" Over the following weeks, Master Yoshida gave Daisuke a new kind of training. Instead of encouraging more questions, the teacher assigned periods of silent observation where the young monk was instructed simply to notice what was actually present in each moment without analyzing, categorizing, or seeking explanations. "For the next week," the master said, "I want you to spend 1 hour each morning sitting quietly in the garden. But instead of asking questions about what you observe, simply notice what is here. See colors without naming them. Hear sounds without identifying their sources. Feel sensations without judging whether they're pleasant or unpleasant." This assignment proved much more challenging for Daisuke than answering complex philosophical questions had been. His mind was so accustomed to generating inquiries and seeking explanations that simply receiving direct experience felt almost impossible at first. But gradually, as he practiced this quality of open attention, Daisuke began to discover something remarkable. The awareness that could see colors, hear sounds, and feel sensations was itself peaceful and clear, without needing any information about what it was observing. This awareness didn't require answers to questions. It didn't need philosophical frameworks to explain its experiences. It simply received whatever was present with natural ease and clarity. More surprisingly, this direct awareness seemed to understand things in a way that intellectual analysis could not provide. When Daisuke observed a flower blooming in the garden with complete attention and no questions, he would find himself understanding something about impermanence, beauty, and the nature of life that no amount of reading or discussion had ever conveyed. When he watched clouds moving across the sky with patient observation rather than curious inquiry, insights about change, flow, and non-attachment would arise naturally without being pursued or formulated into concepts. After several months of this new approach to learning, Daisuke approached Master Yoshida with a very different demeanor than he had shown during his question-asking period.